December 18th, 1941, 05:47 hours. Outskirts of Moscow, minus 35 degrees Celsius. Lieutenant Dmitri Volkov crouched in a snow-filled trench, his breath crystallizing instantly in the pre-dawn darkness, and watched through frozen binoculars as shapes moved through the birch forest 200 meters distant. German infantry, advancing through waist-deep snow with the methodical patience of professionals who knew the Russian winter killed more men than bullets. Around him, his battalion waited in defensive positions, hastily dug into ground so frozen that entrenching tools had shattered against it like glass. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Volkov lowered the binoculars and reached for his MP40 submachine gun, noting with growing unease how sluggish the bolt felt when he pulled it back. The weapon's metal components, despite the canvas wrapping and careful maintenance, had contracted in the killing cold. He'd been an engineering student at Leningrad Polytechnic before the draft found him in 1940, and his technical mind understood what was happening at the molecular level. Metal shrinking, lubricants thickening to the consistency of tar, tolerances that worked at room temperature becoming friction points at 40 degrees below freezing. "Comrade Lieutenant," Senior Sergeant Pyotr Konstantin whispered, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who'd fought in the Winter War against Finland. "The weapons will function when needed. Soviet engineering is superior to fascist simplicity. The motherland does not produce inferior equipment." Volkov wanted to argue, to point out the simple physics of thermal contraction, the way their PPD-40s required machining tolerances measured in hundredths of millimeters. How complexity became vulnerability in extreme conditions. But Konstantin's eyes held the fervor of ideological conviction, the kind that could see a man denounced for defeatist thinking if the political officer overheard. So Volkov nodded and turned back to watch the advancing Germans. At 06:12 hours, the forest erupted. German soldiers materialized from the snow-covered terrain with tactical precision, their white winter camouflage making them nearly invisible against the landscape. Volkov raised his PPD-40, sighted on a figure 50 meters away, and squeezed the trigger. The bolt moved forward with agonizing slowness. The weapon fired, once, twice, then the action froze completely. Around him, the same nightmare repeated across the Soviet line. The distinctive chatter of submachine guns that should have created an impenetrable wall of fire instead produced sporadic pops and mechanical clicks. Men hammered their weapons with gloved fists, desperately trying to clear actions that had turned into solid blocks of frozen steel. The answering fire from the German positions was steady, methodical, devastating. The distinctive sound of MP40 submachine guns, a slower, more controlled rate of fire than Soviet weapons, rolled across the snow like industrial machinery. 3-round bursts, precise and unrelenting. The sound that would haunt Volkov's dreams for years to come. The sound of weapons that simply refused to stop functioning. Konstantin rose from the trench with a roar, his PPD-40 held high, charging toward a German position 30 meters away. He made it 15 meters before his weapon jammed completely. Volkov watched in horror as Konstantin's hands worked frantically at the frozen action, as a German soldier stepped into view. Sergeant Klaus Stanner of the 87th Infantry Division raised his MP40 with the calm professionalism of a Bavarian police officer who trained on this weapon since 1938. 3-round bursts, center mass. Konstantin fell into the snow, his frozen weapon still clutched in his hands, the bolt seized solid by the cold that had killed him as surely as the bullets. For 3 hours, Volkov's battalion fought a losing battle against both the Germans and their own equipment. Men died trying to clear jammed weapons. Others threw down their useless PPD-40s and fought with rifles, with grenades, with entrenching tools. The Germans advanced with methodical efficiency, their MP40s firing continuously, clearing position after position with submachine gun fire that never seemed to stop. Volkov survived by retreating, by dragging wounded men through the snow while his useless weapon hung from his shoulder like an accusation. As German soldiers secured the position, he watched them from a distant tree line. No executions of the wounded, no celebratory shots fired into the air. They simply advanced, professionals completing a day's grim work, their weapons functioning in conditions that had turned Soviet submachine guns into expensive clubs. In the snow near Konstantin's body, Volkov found a fallen German soldier's MP40. He picked it up, noting how the weapon's action still moved smoothly despite being covered in ice. His engineering mind cataloged details: stamped steel construction, minimal moving parts, a magazine that fed by simple gravity. The weapon was crude-looking compared to the PPD-40's machined elegance, but it worked. In minus 35 degrees Celsius conditions, where Soviet weapons had frozen solid, this simple German submachine gun functioned as reliably as a hammer. As artillery fire began falling on the former Soviet positions, Volkov retreated with the remnants of his battalion. 40% casualties. Not from German tactical superiority or numerical advantage, but from equipment that failed when soldiers needed it most. He carried the captured MP40 with him, knowing that understanding why this weapon worked when Soviet weapons failed might save more lives than any tactical report he could write.
Behind him, in the snow, Konstantin's frozen weapon lay beside his body, a monument to the price of denying uncomfortable truths. 3 days after the ambush, Volkov sat in a makeshift headquarters established in a half-destroyed school on Moscow's outskirts. The blackboard behind him still showed a child's mathematics lesson, now overlaid with tactical maps and casualty reports. Around a wooden table scarred with cigarette burns, other surviving officers repeated variations of the same story. Weapons freezing mid-combat, German submachine guns working flawlessly, positions overrun not by superior tactics, but by equipment failure. The divisional commander, Colonel Fyodor Mikhailovich, read Volkov's after-action report with a face that grew progressively harder. When he finished, he set the document down with careful precision and looked at Volkov with eyes that had seen men sent to labor camps for lesser sins. Lieutenant, this report states that German weapons performed superior to Soviet weapons. This suggests that fascist engineering surpasses the achievements of Soviet science. This is defeatist thinking. You will revise this report to state that tactical errors, not equipment failures, resulted in the battalion's retreat. Volkov felt his engineering background warring with military necessity. The truth was in the frozen weapons collected from the battlefield, in the 40 dead men whose PPD-40s had turned into useless metal at critical moments. But truth, in Stalin's Soviet Union, was whatever served the state's narrative. Yes, Comrade Colonel, I will revise immediately. That night, by candlelight, in a commandeered apartment, Volkov wrote 2 reports. The official version blamed tactical failures, poor defensive preparation, inadequate winter training. The second report, written in careful technical language, documented every observation his engineering training had cataloged. The PPD-40's 87 individual parts versus the MP40's estimated 36. The complexity of Soviet machining versus German stamped steel. The physics of thermal contraction and material fatigue in extreme cold. He hid the second report in his personal effects, knowing that possessing it could mean execution, but unable to let the truth disappear into political expediency. 40 men had died. Their deaths demanded more than comfortable lies. 800 kilometers away, in Moscow Design Bureau, Vasily Degtyarov sat at his drafting table and read sanitized reports from the front. Too many tactical failures. Too many retreats blamed on winter conditions and German numbers. The patterns troubled him. Degtyarov had designed the PPD-40, had received Stalin prizes for weapons that were supposed to represent the pinnacle of Soviet engineering. But the reports, despite their careful political language, suggested that something was terribly wrong. He pulled out technical drawings of his PPD-40 design, studying the weapon he'd created with a craftsman's pride. Every curve had been considered. Every part had been machined to exacting tolerances. The weapon was beautiful, a masterwork of precision engineering. But beauty, Degtyaryov was beginning to suspect, might not matter in minus 35 degrees Celsius combat conditions. On the front, Corporal Ivan Vanya Kozlov returned from a night reconnaissance patrol carrying something wrapped in canvas. Kozlov was 34 years old, too old for the infantry, but too useful to transfer. He'd been a factory foreman in peacetime, a man who understood machines and trusted his eyes over propaganda. "Lieutenant," he said to Volkov, unwrapping the canvas to reveal a German MP40. "Found this on a dead fascist. Thought you might want to see it." Within minutes, Soviet soldiers gathered around the captured weapon like medieval peasants examining a religious artifact. They worked the action, marveled at its simplicity, compared it to their own PPD-40s. The differences were stark and damning. Where Soviet weapons required skilled machinists to produce precision-fitted parts, the MP40 used stamped steel components that fit together with generous tolerances. Where Soviet designs used complex spring mechanisms, the MP40 relied on simple gravity to feed its magazine. Volkov disassembled both weapons side by side on a plank table, documenting each difference in a notebook that already contained technical sketches and observations. The PPD-40 was objectively more beautiful, its machined parts gleaming with the artisan's care. The MP40 looked crude by comparison, its stamped steel parts showing tool marks and rough edges. But the MP40 had fired in minus 35 degrees Celsius combat conditions, while PPD-40s froze solid at critical moments. "Comrade Lieutenant," the battalion political officer said quietly, appearing at Volkov's shoulder, "be careful about drawing conclusions that praise fascist technology. The motherland's enemies would call such thinking treasonous." Volkov met the man's eyes and saw not threat, but warning. The political officer was 23, a true believer from Moscow who quoted Lenin and Stalin like scripture. But he'd also watched men die with frozen weapons in their hands. "I'm simply documenting enemy equipment for intelligence purposes, comrade political officer. Understanding their weapons helps us defeat them." Understanding, yes. Admiration, no. Remember the distinction.
That night, Volkov dreamed of Konstantin's face, that final expression of betrayal when his weapon had failed him. In the dream, the clicking of jammed weapons mixed with the steady staccato of German MP40s, a sound that had become the soundtrack of Soviet retreat. He woke in darkness, his hands instinctively reaching for his weapon, finding it cold and inert beside him. The captured MP40 lay in a corner of the room, its simple stamped steel construction accusatory in the moonlight. Volkov understood that he was holding a secret that could save Soviet lives or end his own. In Stalin's Russia, those possibilities were often identical. The report he'd hidden in his personal effects would eventually find its way to Moscow through informal officer networks, men who cared more about winning the war than maintaining comfortable fictions. But the machinery of Soviet bureaucracy moved slowly, and in the months it would take for truth to reach decision-makers, thousands more soldiers would die with frozen weapons in their hands.
Somewhere in the darkness, across the frozen battlefield, Sergeant Klaus Steiner cleaned his MP40 with the methodical care of a professional. He didn't know that his weapon had become a symbol, that Soviet engineers would eventually study it with the intensity of scholars examining sacred texts. He only knew that in the Russian winter, his simple stamped steel submachine gun worked when more elegant weapons failed. That practical truth would change the course of industrial warfare, but first it would have to survive Soviet pride. The story shifts backward in time, to Germany, December 1938, 3 years before Soviet soldiers would die with frozen weapons in their hands. In a workshop on the outskirts of Erfurt, Heinrich Vollmer sat at a workbench surrounded by disassembled submachine guns, his hands blackened with gun oil, his mind fixed on a single obsessive principle. Every unnecessary part is a future failure. Vollmer was 52 years old, a veteran of the Great War who'd watched friends die in the mud of Verdun when their weapons jammed at critical moments. He'd spent 20 years designing firearms, and every design carried the trauma of those memories, the clicking of a seized bolt, the expression on a soldier's face when he realized his weapon had become useless metal, the sound of enemy fire answered only by mechanical failure. The MP38 prototype on his workbench represented a radical departure from conventional submachine gun design. Where other weapons used machined steel parts fitted to tight tolerances, Vollmer's design used stamped steel, crude sheet metal bent and formed like an industrial product rather than a precision instrument. Where other designs used complex spring mechanisms, Vollmer eliminated springs wherever possible. Where traditional weapons required skilled craftsmen to assemble, Vollmer's design could be assembled by semi-skilled workers in a fraction of the time. Wehrmacht officers who visited his workshop looked at the prototype with barely concealed disdain. General Hans von Seeckt, inspecting the weapon in preparation for potential adoption, handled it like a man examining a cheap tool. Herr Vollmer, this weapon looks crude. The stamped steel construction gives it the appearance of a farmer's implement, not a military firearm. German soldiers deserve better than this. Vollmer had heard this before. He set down his tools and met the general's eyes with the quiet confidence of a man who understood material reality better than military tradition. General, in winter, when temperatures drop to 30 degrees below freezing, when your enemy's weapon freezes solid and yours continues firing, you will not care about appearance. You will care only about reliability. This weapon has 36 major parts. Your current standard submachine gun has 78. Every part I eliminated is one less component that can break, freeze, or fail. Simplicity is not weakness. Simplicity is the highest form of engineering sophistication. The general's aide, a young captain with engineering training, picked up the weapon and worked its action. The tolerances are much looser than standard military specifications. Intentionally, Vollmer responded. Tight tolerances are the enemy of reliability in field conditions. When metal contracts in extreme cold, when mud enters the action, when sand or dirt contaminates the mechanism, loose tolerances allow the weapon to continue functioning. I have designed a weapon that works not because conditions are perfect, but despite conditions being terrible. The MP38 was adopted, then refined into the MP40. Vollmer's obsessive simplicity became German military standard. The weapon that looked crude was actually the product of sophisticated understanding, recognition that in combat, reliability mattered more than elegance, that function superseded form, that soldiers' lives depended on weapons that worked in the worst possible conditions. The narrative shifts forward in time to December 1941 to Oberst Friedrich Walter's office in Berlin. Walter served in military logistics, the unglamorous work of tracking equipment performance, reading field reports, compiling statistics that told stories commanders often didn't want to hear. His desk was covered with reports from the Eastern Front, and the patterns were undeniable. MP40 malfunction rate in temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius, 1.8%. Soviet PPD-40 malfunction rate in identical conditions, 43%. German submachine gun effectiveness in winter combat, exceptional. Soviet submachine gun effectiveness, catastrophic. Walther compiled these statistics into a comprehensive report, then did something unusual. He wrote a personal letter to Heinrich Vollmer, now retired but still alive in Erfurt. Herr Vollmer, I write to inform you that your obsession with simplicity has proven prophetic. The Russian winter is the ultimate testing ground for military equipment, and your MP40 passes where more sophisticated weapons fail. Soviet submachine guns, which on paper possess superior specifications and more elegant engineering, freeze solid in combat conditions. Our soldiers advance with functioning weapons, while enemy soldiers die holding frozen mechanical failures. You told skeptical officers that simplicity would prove its value in extreme conditions. You were correct. The 78 parts you eliminated from traditional designs are 78 potential failure points that do not exist in combat. Your weapon looks crude, but functions flawlessly. This is the definition of good engineering. The Soviets will eventually capture our weapons and study them. They will face a choice: admit German engineering superiority and copy your design philosophy, or cling to pride and continue losing soldiers to equipment failures. That choice will determine who wins the Eastern Front. Your vision has saved more German lives than any tactical innovation. History will remember the MP40 not for its appearance, but for its reliability. Walther sent the letter, not knowing it would eventually be captured by Soviet intelligence and become part of the chain of evidence that convinced Soviet designers to abandon pride for pragmatism. Vollmer received the letter in his Erfurt home, reading it by fireplace light while snow fell outside. He felt no triumph, only the grim satisfaction of a man whose trauma-born insights had proven correct. He thought of the friends who died in the Great War, their weapons jammed by mud and complexity. The MP40 was his monument to them, a weapon that honored their deaths by being simple enough to work when soldiers needed it most. He wrote back to Walther, "The Soviets are not fools. They will learn. Good engineering transcends nationalism. When they copy this philosophy, they should not feel shame. They should feel wisdom. War is too serious for pride." That letter would never be sent. Vollmer kept it in his desk, where it would be found after his death in 1945. Soviet troops occupying Erfurt would discover it, translate it, and add it to files documenting German weapons development. The letter's philosophy, that good design transcends political systems, that learning from enemies is wisdom, not weakness, would influence a generation of Soviet engineers. But in December 1941, that future remained uncertain. Soviet soldiers were dying with frozen weapons. German soldiers were advancing with functioning ones. The MP40's elegant simplicity had created tactical advantage that altered the calculus of Eastern Front combat. In the frozen trenches outside Moscow, Lieutenant Dmitri Volkov slept with a captured MP40 beside him, dreaming of mechanisms that worked when they were needed most. In Berlin, Oberst Walther filed reports documenting German superiority, unaware that these same reports would soon fall into Soviet hands. In Moscow, Vasily Degtyaryov stared at technical drawings of his PPD-40, beginning to understand that the weapon he'd crafted with pride had become a liability measured in frozen corpses. The pieces were moving into position. The captured weapon, the hidden technical report, the statistical evidence. the letter from one engineer to another, expressing a philosophy that would bridge enemy lines through the universal language of material reality. Heinrich Vollmer's ghost, his philosophy made steel, his trauma-born insights embodied in stamped metal and loose tolerances, was winning the war one functioning weapon at a time. The question was whether Soviet pride could bend quickly enough to learn the lesson before pride killed too many of its soldiers. The Russian winter, merciless and impartial, would be the ultimate judge. It had already passed its verdict on the PPD-40. The verdict was damning, written in the frozen actions of weapons that failed when soldiers needed them most. In his Erfurt workshop, Vollmer kept working on refinements to his design, always seeking to eliminate one more unnecessary part, to simplify one more mechanism, to make reliability even more absolute. He understood something that military traditions often forgot. In combat, perfection was the enemy of good enough. The weapon that worked consistently in terrible conditions beat the weapon that worked perfectly in ideal conditions. This philosophy, born from mud and blood in the Great War, refined through 2 decades of obsessive engineering, was about to reshape Soviet industrial warfare.
January 15, 1942, Moscow, People's Commissariat of Armaments. Alexei Sudayev received the summons at 0600 hours, a black car, 2 NKVD officers who said nothing during the drive through snow-choked streets. At 31, Sudayev had designed components for various weapons projects, competent work that attracted neither praise nor suspicion. He was the son of a blacksmith from Arzamas, a man who understood metal through his hands before his mind, who'd earned his engineering credentials through night school while working factory floors. He had no idea why he was being summoned to a meeting that, based on the NKVD presence, could easily end in a basement cell. The conference room was warm, almost stifling after the January cold. Senior officials sat around a long table, men whose faces Sudayev recognized from newspapers, whose decisions shaped Soviet industrial output. At the head of the table sat a representative from Stalin's personal staff, a man whose presence transformed this from a technical meeting into something far more dangerous. On the table before them lay a German MP40 submachine gun, disassembled into components. Beside it sat a stack of papers, reports, documents, what looked like technical drawings. "Comrade Sudayev," the Stalin representative's voice was flat, bureaucratic, terrifying in its lack of emotion. "You have been selected to answer a direct question from Comrade Stalin himself. Explain how German engineering surpasses Soviet engineering." The room's temperature seemed to drop 30 degrees. Every man present understood the trap. Admit German superiority, and you confessed to defeatism. Deny it, and you contradicted Stalin's own observation. Either path led to potential execution. Sudayev stood, his hand steady despite the fear coursing through him. He thought of his father, who taught him that metal doesn't lie, that material reality cares nothing for politics or ideology. He thought of the reports he'd read in recent weeks, sanitized descriptions that couldn't quite hide the truth. Soviet soldiers were dying because their weapons failed. "May I approach the table, Comrade Representative?" Permission granted. Sudayev walked to the table where the MP40 lay in pieces. He picked up the stamped steel receiver, feeling its weight, its balance. Then he gestured to an aide who brought forward a PPD-40, which Sudayev proceeded to disassemble with practiced efficiency. "German engineering does not surpass Soviet engineering in precision, in craftsmanship, or in theoretical design." Sudayev's voice was steady, choosing each word with the care of a man diffusing a bomb. He held up the MP40's receiver. "This is stamped from flat steel. Crude, yes. It looks like something made for children, for toys. But observe." He ran his finger along the smooth interior. "No tight tolerances, no precision machine surfaces that ice can grip. When this weapon is submerged in freezing water,
The ice has nowhere to grip. Then he held up the PPD-40's intricately machined receiver. This is art. This is craftsmanship. 87 precision components, each machined to tolerances measured in hundreds of millimeters. Beautiful. And in temperatures below -30, these tight tolerances become death traps. Ice forms in microscopic gaps. Lubricants freeze. Springs lose tension. The weapon becomes a club. Vasily Degtyaryov, the PPD-40's designer, sat 3 chairs down, his face carved from stone. Sudayev met his eyes, briefly, apology and challenge in equal measure. Comrade Stalin asks how German engineering surpasses ours. The answer is, they designed for reality, not theory. They ask, what is the minimum needed for a reliable fire? We asked, what is the maximum perfection we can achieve? In the laboratory, our weapons excel. In the frozen forests where our soldiers die, German simplicity defeats Soviet sophistication. The silence that followed felt like falling into a frozen lake. Every official in the room understood that Sudayev had just criticized Soviet design philosophy, implicitly blamed Soviet pride for soldier deaths, and advocated learning from the enemy. Any of these could be interpreted as defeatism. The Stalin representative studied Sudayev for a long moment. You propose what, exactly? That we abandon our pride, that we study this German weapon not as an enemy artifact, but as a teacher, that we design weapons asking not how beautiful can we make this, but how reliably will this fire when covered in ice, mud, and blood, that we— Sudayev paused, knowing the next words were the most dangerous, that we copy what works even if it comes from fascists. Another silence. Then Vasily Degtyaryov stood, his face unreadable. I designed the PPD-40, he said quietly. I spent 5 years perfecting its mechanism. I received the Stalin Prize for this work. And Comrade Sudayev is correct. My pride has killed Soviet soldiers. The room erupted in murmurs. A Stalin Prize winner admitting failure was unprecedented. This young man has done what I could not. He has looked past ideology to see truth. He has admitted that sometimes the enemy understands what we do not. I recommend immediate approval of his proposal and offer my facilities, my resources, and my reputation in support of his work.
The Stalin representative made notes, his expression revealing nothing. Finally, Comrade Sudayev, you have 60 days to present a prototype that incorporates lessons from German design while maintaining Soviet production capabilities. If you fail, both you and Comrade Degtyaryov will answer for this advocacy of copying fascist weapons. If you succeed, the slightest pause, we will call it Soviet innovation and never speak of German influence again. Are these terms acceptable? Sudayev understood perfectly. Copy, but lie about copying. Learn, but deny the teacher. It was hypocrisy, but it was survival, both for him and for Soviet soldiers who deserved weapons that worked. Yes, Comrade Representative, 60 days. As Sudayev left the building, Degtyaryov caught up with him in the frozen courtyard. You are either very brave or very foolish, the older man said. In Stalin's Russia, those are the same thing. I am neither brave nor foolish. I am simply a blacksmith's son who understands that metal doesn't care about ideology. Reality is the final judge. The winter has rendered its verdict on our weapons. We can accept the verdict and adapt, or we can maintain our pride and watch more soldiers die. Then let us hope, Degtyaryov said quietly, that 60 days is enough time to teach an entire industrial system humility. That night, Sudayev returned to his workshop with the captured MP40 and a refrigerated test chamber. He had 60 days to design a weapon that could match German cold-weather reliability, 60 days to convince Soviet industry to abandon precision for simplicity, 60 days to copy the enemy without admitting the copying. In Stalin's Russia, innovation required navigating minefields as deadly as any German position, but Soviet soldiers deserved weapons that worked.
That truth transcended politics, ideology, and pride. Sudiev picked up his drafting tools and began to draw. February 8, 1942, 20 kilometers west of Moscow. The temperature had stabilized at -32°C, cold enough to kill exposed skin in minutes, cold enough to turn breath into clouds of ice crystals, cold enough to transform the testing of weapons into an existential experiment where data was purchased with lives. Lieutenant Dmitri Volkov led his newly formed weapons testing platoon through frozen forest, each man carrying prototype modifications to the PPD-40. Behind them, sleds carried thermometers, notebooks, and ammunition, the tools of scientific warfare. Their orders were explicit: engage German units, document weapon performance, survive if possible. The testing data mattered more than the testers. Volkov had been transferred to this unit because of his engineering background and his obsessive documentation of weapon failures. Someone in Moscow, he suspected it was Degtярov or perhaps Sudiev, had read his unofficial reports and recognized value in a soldier who could think like an engineer while bullets flew. At 14:30 hours, they encountered a German patrol in a village of abandoned wooden houses. Volkov recognized the tactical signature before he saw the soldiers: methodical movement, professional spacing, the efficiency of experienced infantry. And leading them, visible through binoculars, was a face Volkov remembered from the December ambush: Sergeant Klaus Steiner. The recognition was mutual. Across 200 meters of snow-covered ground, two professional soldiers acknowledged each other with the briefest of nods. Then the battle began. Volkov's modified PTD-40 fired 17 rounds before the bolt froze mid-cycle. He recorded the malfunction in his notebook: temperature, -32, 17 rounds fired, bolt seizure due to ice formation in receiver, even as he cleared the jam and resumed firing. Around him, the testing platoon conducted warfare as scientific method: shoot, document, adapt, repeat. Steiner's MP40 fired without pause. Volkov watched through the chaos of combat as the German sergeant changed magazines, engaged targets, moved between positions, all with a weapon that simply refused to quit. The contrast was brutal and undeniable. Soviet modifications helped, but German design philosophy won. The firefight lasted 11 minutes. Volkov's platoon inflicted 3 German casualties while taking 7. Not a victory, but the data gathered was invaluable. After the Germans withdrew, Volkov found a fallen German soldier, his MP40 lying beside him in the snow. Beside the weapon was a small leather notebook, maintenance logs. That night, by candlelight in a commandeered bunker, Volkov translated the German text with his limited language skills from university. The logs detailed cleaning schedules, round counts, malfunction reports. What struck Volkov was not what the logs contained, but what they didn't. The MP40 required far less maintenance than Soviet weapons. No complex disassembly for cleaning, no precision adjustments, simply wipe down, oil lightly, function check. The weapon was designed for soldiers, not gunsmiths.
800 kilometers away in Moscow, Alexei Sudiev worked 18-hour days in a workshop that smelled of machine oil and desperation. Captured MP40s surrounded him in various states of disassembly. His notebook contained sketches, calculations, and observations that read like love letters to simplicity. February 10th, no unnecessary curves. Every angle serves function. The trigger mechanism contains 7 parts. Ours uses 19. Why? Because we designed for beauty. They designed for reliability. February 15th. Tested stamped receiver in refrigerated chamber, -40 degrees. No binding. Soviet machined receiver seized after 30 seconds. The answer has been in front of us. Loose tolerances are not weakness. They are wisdom. February 18th. Father once told me, good blacksmith makes sword that looks impressive, Master blacksmith makes sword that doesn't break in battle. Germans are master blacksmiths. The breakthrough came on February 22nd, when Sudiev replicated German stamping techniques using Soviet steel. The results were crude by Soviet standards: visible tool marks, rough edges, no aesthetic appeal. But when tested in the refrigeration chamber, the stamped components functioned flawlessly at temperatures where precision-machined Soviet parts failed. Sudiev stared at the test results, feeling something between triumph and grief. The solution was so simple: abandon tight tolerances, use stamped steel, eliminate unnecessary parts, design for soldiers in frozen forests, not for design reviews in heated conference rooms. Every Soviet soldier who died with a frozen weapon had been killed by Soviet pride and precision. That same night, Volkov's platoon encountered Steiner's unit again. This time, the engagement was at close range in ruined buildings, the kind of chaotic close-quarters battle where automatic weapons determine survival. Volkov's modified PPD-40 jammed twice in 30 seconds. Both times he nearly died. Both times he survived through luck and the fact that German soldiers were also taking cover. He watched Steiner move through the building's interior with practiced efficiency, his MP40 firing controlled bursts, never jamming, never hesitating. There was no hatred in the German's face, no ideology, just professional competence, a craftsman doing terrible work with reliable tools. After the battle, Volkov sat in the ruins and wrote, "Recommendation: abandon all modifications to PPD-40. System is fundamentally flawed. Request permission to design new weapon based on German principles. We are refining a weapon that should be replaced, improving a philosophy that should be discarded. Soviet soldiers die while we perfect complexity. Germans advance with simple weapons that work. Reality has rendered verdict. We must accept or perish." He sent the report to Moscow, knowing it might end his career or his life. But Konstantin's frozen face haunted him, the memory of a brave soldier killed by equipment failure. If documenting truth meant execution, so be it. At least the truth would be documented. In Moscow, Sudiev received Volkov's report along with dozens of similar assessments from the front. The message was unanimous, brutal, undeniable. Soviet weapons were killing Soviet soldiers through complexity. German simplicity was winning battles. Sudiev picked up his drafting tools and began designing a new weapon from first principles. Not an improvement to existing designs, not a refinement of Soviet philosophy. A completely new approach built on German wisdom about simplicity and adapted for Soviet mass production capabilities. He had 38 days remaining until his deadline. 38 days to design a weapon that could match the MP40's reliability. 38 days to convince Soviet industry that copying the enemy was survival, not surrender. Outside, the February wind carried snow across Moscow streets. In frozen forests west of the city, Soviet soldiers fought with weapons that betrayed them. German soldiers advanced with reliable tools. And somewhere in the data Volkov sent, the winter's lesson became undeniable. Reality favors simplicity. Complexity kills, and pride is paid for in blood. March 14, 1942, Moscow, People's Commissariat of Armaments, Conference Room 7. Alexei Sudiev stood before the same assembly of officials who'd given him 60 days to solve an impossible problem. 59 days had passed. His prototype weapon lay on the table before them, accompanied by test data, production diagrams, and a presentation that could either save Soviet soldiers or end Sudiev's life. The weapon looked wrong. Experienced eyes accustomed to Soviet craftsmanship saw crude stamped steel, rough welds, minimal parts.
The design principles, Sudiev continued, are adapted from study of captured German MP40s, modified for Soviet production capabilities and mass manufacturing infrastructure. The Germans understand that loose tolerances and simple mechanisms create reliability.
We have taken this lesson and applied Soviet industrial advantages, our capacity for rapid stamping, our existing production facilities, our steel quality, to create a weapon that is simpler than German designs, but producible in greater quantities. There it was, the admission that would either be accepted as pragmatism or condemned as defeatism. He'd said aloud what everyone knew, but no one could acknowledge. The weapon was based on learning from the enemy. The silence stretched. Then Vasily Degtyaryov stood. "I designed the PP40, Degtyaryov said, his voice carrying the weight of reputation and years. I spent 5 years perfecting its mechanism. I pursued precision, beauty, craftsmanship. I created a weapon worthy of display in museums." He paused, "And my pride has killed Soviet soldiers." The room erupted in murmurs. A Stalin Prize winner publicly admitting his design's flaws was unprecedented, potentially suicidal. "Comrade Sudayev has done what I could not, admit that our enemy understood something we forgot. He has looked at German weapons without prejudice, seeing not fascist tools, but design philosophy. He has committed the greatest heresy in Stalin's Russia. He has suggested we learn from our enemies." Degtyaryov's voice hardened, "and he is absolutely correct. I recommend immediate field testing of this prototype. I offer my facilities for production development. I stake my reputation and my life on the assertion that this weapon will save Soviet lives. If I am wrong, I will accept the consequences. But Soviet soldiers deserve weapons that function, not weapons that look impressive in design reviews." The political officer present, a man whose word could mean execution, leaned forward. "You are advocating that we copy fascist weapons." "No," Sudayev interjected quickly. "I am advocating that we learn universal principles of reliable design that the Germans happened to discover first. Simplicity defeating complexity is not German or Soviet, it is physics. Metal contracting in cold is not ideology, it is thermodynamics. We are not copying fascist weapons, we are acknowledging material reality." The Stalin representative, who'd given Sudayev his original 60-day deadline, consulted notes, his face unreadable. The room waited in suffocating silence. Careers, lives, and potentially thousands of Soviet soldiers' fates hung on his decision. "Field testing will commence immediately," the representative finally announced. "Prototype weapons will be produced and sent to frontline units for 90 days of combat evaluation. If testing validates claims of superior cold weather reliability, production will be authorized." He paused, and his next words carried unmistakable menace. "If the weapon fails, both Comrade Sudayev and Comrade Degtyaryov will answer for advocating defeatist copying of enemy designs." Then came the crucial face-saving clause. "When production begins, all documentation will refer to this as Soviet innovation developed through superior socialist engineering. German influence will not be mentioned. Any suggestion that we learn from fascists will be treated as defeatism. Are these terms understood?" "Yes, Comrade Representative," Sudayev and Degtyaryov answered in unison. The unspoken agreement was crystalline. Copy, but lie about it. Learn, but deny the teacher. Save soldiers' lives, but pretend Soviet pride remained intact. It was hypocrisy built on necessity, pragmatism wrapped in ideological fiction. As officials departed, the political officer approached Sudayev. "You walk a dangerous line, comrade designer. This weapon succeeds, you are a hero. It fails, you are a saboteur. There is no middle ground." "I understand, but Soviet soldiers are dying with frozen weapons. If I can prevent those deaths by walking dangerous lines, then I will walk them." After the room emptied, Degtyaryov pulled Sudayev aside. "You have 60 days until the first field reports arrive. Use them well. We have both staked our lives on German philosophy wrapped in Soviet production. If the winter rejects your design, we die. If it validates your design, we live but must pretend we discovered these principles ourselves."
April 12, 1942. Soviet forward positions west of Moscow. Alexei Sudayev arrived with his prototype weapons in a supply truck, ignoring protocol that kept designers safely behind lines. Lieutenant Dmitri Volkov met him at the command bunker. These two architects of adaptation, soldier-engineer and engineer-soldier, finally face to face. "Your report started this," Sudayev said, gripping Volkov's hand. "You documented truth when others wrote acceptable lies." "Your weapon may finish it," Volkov replied, "if it works." For 8 weeks, they collaborated in a partnership that transcended rank and background. Volkov taught Sudayev what combat actually demanded: magazine changes with frozen fingers, weapon handling in desperate positions, the brutal reality of fighting at -30. Sudayev taught Volkov to see weapons as systems where every component interaction mattered. They conducted deliberate engagements, targeting areas where Steiner's unit operated, turning warfare into comparative testing. Each firefight generated data: temperature, round count, malfunction type, failure mode. Combat became laboratory. Death became data points. On May 3rd, at -28°C, the critical test occurred. Volkov's prototype functioned flawlessly through a 15-minute engagement. Beside him, a soldier with an old PPD-40 died when his weapon froze mid-burst. The contrast was immediate, brutal, undeniable. Sudayev's design worked. German philosophy, adapted to Soviet production, had created reliability. After the battle, Sudayev sat in the bunker haunted. "Every improvement I make is measured in Russian lives saved," he said quietly. That German designer, Vollmer, he understood this. Our weapons were art. His weapon was mercy. Volkov responded, "Then we must show the same mercy to our soldiers. We must copy what works without shame." Across the battlefield, Steiner observed Soviet weapon improvements through his binoculars, noting faster fire rates, fewer malfunctions. His report to Oberst Walther was professional, analytical. Enemy weapons showing significant improvement. Design modifications suggest study of captured MP40s. Soviet adaptation capability exceeds projections. The student was learning. The teacher watched with professional respect. July 1942, Slatust Arms Factory, Ural Mountains. Klavia Nazarova, 19 years old with 2 brothers dead at the front, learned to operate stamping presses that would replace skilled machinists. The PPSH-41, Sudayev's design, credited to Degtyarev for political protection, required 2.7 hours of production time versus the PPD-40's 7.3 hours. Soviet industry, built for heavy machinery and mass production, proved unexpectedly perfect for stamped steel manufacturing. Engineers discovered that Soviet weaknesses, inability to match German precision, became strengths when producing crude, effective components. Where German factories excelled at tight tolerances, Soviet facilities dominated rapid stamping. Degtyarev visited factories monthly, witnessing his transformation from artisan to coordinator. He wrote to Sudayev, "You have made me obsolete, and I thank you for it. Every weapon leaving these factories is a life saved. I spent decades pursuing perfection. You pursued pragmatism. History will remember which mattered more." By December, production reached 3,000 units daily. Soviet output exceeded German MP40 manufacturing 5-1. The industrial giant, once slow to adapt, now channeled its massive capacity toward German-inspired simplicity multiplied by Soviet scale. Klavia stamped receivers thinking of her brothers, each press of metal a small revenge, each weapon a chance to save someone else's brother. Her hands moved with precision born from purpose, transforming crude steel into tools of survival. German intelligence reports noted the production surge with professional concern. Soviet submachine gun output increasing exponentially. Design simplification suggests institutional learning. Quantitative advantage now matched by qualitative improvement. January 1943, village of Krasny Bor. Sergeant Klaus Steiner's squad advanced through ruins, encountering devastating Soviet firepower that mirrored the December 1941 ambush, but with positions reversed.
PPSH-41 fire erupted from multiple positions, working flawlessly in -30-degree cold. 3 Soviet weapons for every German MP40. Steiner's squad took heavy casualties. For the first time, Germans were outgunned in close combat. His after-action report reached Walther. Soviets have learned what we taught them and added their own lesson. Quantity multiplied by quality equals victory. Enemy weapons now match ours in reliability while exceeding ours in numbers. In Moscow, Sudayev received the Order of Lenin. The ceremony felt hollow. He was being honored for copying German philosophy, though the citation carefully avoided mentioning this. He visited wounded soldiers in hospitals, seeing men alive because weapons hadn't failed them. One soldier who'd served with Konstantin told Sudayev, "My sergeant died because his weapon froze. I live because mine didn't. You gave me the chance to avenge him." The moral complexity crushed Sudayev. He'd saved Russian lives by learning from Germans who were killing Russians. Success measured an enemy philosophy adopted. Triumph shadowed by the knowledge that German wisdom, not Soviet pride, had shown the path. Volkov, now a decorated veteran, saw his journey's completion, from ideological soldier to pragmatic survivor to advocate for adaptation. His reports started the chain that led here. Soviet weapons that worked, Soviet soldiers who lived. August 1946. Alexei Sudayev died at age 33, his health destroyed by wartime overwork. He never saw mass production of his ultimate design, the PPS-43, even simpler than the PPSH-41, pure distillation of Vollmer's philosophy, adapted for Soviet needs. Dmitri Volkov survived the war, becoming a military instructor teaching new officers. Pride is the first casualty of effective warfare. The winter of 1941 taught us that survival requires learning from enemies, that simplicity defeats complexity, and that reality cares nothing for ideology.
Captured post-war German documents revealed Vollmer's 1942 letter expressing professional satisfaction that his philosophy proved correct in history's ultimate laboratory, the Eastern Front. Walther's writings showed respect for Soviet industrial adaptation, acknowledging that the student had surpassed the teacher through sheer production scale. 1960s. Cold War weapons showed MP40's influence. The AK-47 stamped receiver owed conceptual debt to this lineage, proving Vollmer's philosophy transcended national boundaries. 1990s. Elderly Volkov stood in a military museum before an MP40 and PPSH-41 displayed side by side. His grandson asked which was better. "Both," Volkov replied. "They taught each other. The German weapon taught us simplicity. Our production taught them that simplicity multiplied by numbers wins wars." These weapons represent a conversation between enemies who learn to respect material reality more than ideology. The final image. A modern weapons factory where a designer studies both weapons, recognizing that Vollmer's ghost and Sudayev's ghost still debate through every new design. The philosophical argument between complexity and simplicity continues, finding new voices in each generation. Ideas outlive their creators. The winter's lesson, that simplicity equals survival, that pride kills, that learning from enemies is strength, echoes through decades of weapons development. Good design transcends nationalism. Reality remains the final judge. And in frozen forests, where Soviet and German soldiers once fought with competing philosophies made steel, the wind still howls, indifferent to victory or defeat, caring only that some men learned and others didn't, that some adapted and others died, that in the end, the winter judged two philosophies, and both sides learned from the verdict. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.